conversation with the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Stephen Feldstein, on human rights in the DRC. The United Nations Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson talks to VOA on Africa's sustainable development goals. And a look at the beauty of Africa. Africa 54 starts right now. Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. We begin in the United States, and the race for the White House. Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Hillary Clinton were the big winners in the Super Tuesday primary and caucus voting that spawned a dozen states. Each contender took a major step towards securing their party's nomination for president. VOA national correspondent Jim Malone recaps the Super Tuesday results from Washington.
On the biggest night of the 2016 presidential campaign, Republican Donald Trump claimed victory after winning the most states and delegates in regions as different as the South and New England. In the process, he took a giant step toward becoming the party's presidential nominee.
I'm a unifier. I know people are going to find that a little bit hard to believe, but believe me, I am a unifier. Once we get all of this finished, I'm going to go after one person. That's Hillary Clinton.
Senator Ted Cruz won his home state of Texas and neighboring Oklahoma and urged his rivals to step aside so he can take on Trump alone.
And after tonight, we have seen that our campaign is the only campaign that has beaten, that can beat, and that will beat Donald Trump.
Senator Marco Rubio broke through with his first win in Minnesota, but mostly lagged behind.
We are going to send the message that the party of Lincoln and Reagan and the presidency of the United States will never be held by a con artist.
Despite Trump's success, Republican congressional leaders want Trump to more forcefully reject bigotry after supportive comments from a former Ku Klux Klan leader, House Speaker Paul Ryan.
If a person wants to be the nominee of the Republican Party, there can be no evasion and no games. They must reject any group or cause that is built on bigotry.
In the Democratic race, it was a big night for Hillary Clinton, with sweeping victories in several southern states, putting her in a commanding lead for the nomination. Clinton is already shifting some of her focus to the Republicans.
The stakes in this election have never been higher, and the rhetoric we're hearing on the other side has never been lower. Trying to divide America between us and them is wrong, and we're not going to let it work.
Rival Bernie Sanders won his home state of Vermont, along with Oklahoma, Colorado, and Minnesota. He vowed to press on.
We are going to take our fight for economic justice, for social justice, for environmental sanity, for a world of peace to every one of those states.
Still to come, major tests for both parties in some big states in the next 2 weeks. Jim Malone, VOA News, Washington.
Well, according to U.S. Department of Labor report, children in the Democratic Republic of Congo are engaged in child labor and forced mining. Children are also forcibly recruited by armed groups, that's including through abduction for use in armed conflict. The U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Stephen Feldstein, recently returned from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he met with civil society representatives and government officials. Well, Secretary Feldstein joins us today in studio to tell us more about his trip and meetings in the DRC. Welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, not long ago, you came back, as we mentioned. How was your trip? You weren't there at a very critical time.
I was there for a week. It was a very interesting moment, especially because on the Tuesday where I was there was widespread shutdowns called Ville Morte that happened throughout the country. So I was able to kind of witness the effect of that, to meet with people throughout the day and to better understand what that might have on the political process going forward.
Yes, and you met with both sides, the civil society, and you met the government officials. What did the two different groups tell you?
Well, there was a lot of concern, especially leading up to the Tuesday events, about what that would mean. And so the government made it very clear that they would not tolerate any instances of violence. And the opposition, civil society, made very clear that they were very committed to holding peaceful, nonviolent actions.
And we know they're concerned so much about, especially the extension of President Kabila's rule. Is that something that came up in the civil society's conversations? And did they ask the U.S. to do anything very specific?
Well, in fact, that was one of the main points of the whole trip, was really to talk about the electoral timetable and to talk about how and when elections may be able to happen in line with the Constitution. So both sides had very clear messages about that. In the opposition and civil society in particular, they said, look, we are concerned that the right preparations haven't taken place so that we can actually have elections in a very complicated, very large country in November. And what we said is that we are supportive of doing whatever we can as an international community to encourage the government to hold these elections on time in a peaceful manner.
Yes. Now, Secretary Felston, Congo, DRC, is almost synonymous with child labor, child soldiers. How did you address that issue when you were there?
Well, we are aware there's many different human rights concerns, and I think one of the challenges with the Congo, in particular, is where you want to focus your efforts and what you want to specifically focus on, because there's so many things to really discuss. Those are issues that we are actively tracking and working on from Washington, and certainly through our embassy. But for my trip, I was really focused on two things. Number one, the electoral timetable issue. Our election's going to be held on time in line with the Constitution. Number two, is there enough political space for opposition, civil society to campaign and have free expression? Because that is something that for us was extremely concerning. In fact, I can say that while I was there on my trip, several different people, representatives from civil society, were arrested and sentenced to prison terms, really for little else other than saying we want to have a peaceful succession when it comes to the country. So those are the two things that I really focused on while over there.
And we know that in the past, the opposition has really, complained very loudly that the space has always shrunk. They feel that it's even more now. The question is, what is it, or what more can the U.S. do to push the authorities there to open up a little bit, not only for the opposition, but even for journalists, for the media, so that people can have a fair play?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of different things and tools that we have at our disposal. One of the things certainly is the power of persuasion and the voice of the United States. And so we have issued many public statements, including a public statement while I was out on the trip that said we're concerned about detentions and arrests and that freedom of expression is one of the paramount principles that need to be protected. But another thing I would also mention is this. The week before my trip, so in the first week of February, we had several senior officials testify on Capitol Hill. And what our special envoy for the Great Lakes, Tom Perriello, specifically said is that the type of behavior that leads to a violent crackdown and repression of freedom of expression is potentially a cause for the U.S. to consider sanctions. And so that is another tool that I think has been made very clear as something that ought to be considered as part of the overall approach, depending on whether violence starts to break out, whether repression begins to happen in a more significant way, and whether we really truly lose the ability to hold elections in a manner in which the Constitution lays it out.
But, over time, one of the things that has been apparent is that the country is fairly splintered. With all these armed groups in different regions of the DRC, are there conditions really for a free and fair democratic election?
Well, I certainly take your point, and that's one of the reasons why we have a UN stabilization peacekeeping mission that's there. I think things have improved. In fact, I was both in Kinshasa, but I was also in Goma, which is in the eastern part of the DRC, and one of the places that has had a significant amount of the unrest and violence historically that you're describing. I think we can't let that be used as an excuse not to hold elections. I think the people of the Congo are really calling for it. They're hungry for it. I spoke to many people in Goma, many people in Kinshasa, and in my course of my work in Washington, people come through all the time. And the uniform message is hold these elections in a peaceful way, make sure that they're legitimate, and do so in a timely manner.
How about those who say, well, even before we talk about elections, about holding responsible or holding to account those who have violated and grossly violated the rights, the human rights of the people of Congo, including children?
Yeah. I mean, those are ongoing parallel efforts, and I think one should not necessarily dictate the other. In fact, one of the best ways to bring about the kind of accountability and justice that you're mentioning and to put in place the type of reforms that are needed is to hold elections and have new leadership that will take this on as part of their new mandate. That's why we have elections in the United States and many other countries, because sometimes the tough issues, you need fresh eyes. And then that's why the principle of democratic succession is so important to us.
Yeah. The entire region seems to be kind of slowly veering towards a kind of this extension of term limits, and people are concerned about Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda. It's all concentrated in the same area. How much concern is there over a possible effort to do the same, and how will that play up in terms of the stability of the entire region?
Right. Well, I think it's a good question, and frankly, what has happened in Burundi, I think, serves as a very important warning for what potentially could happen in the Congo if the right steps aren't taken to secure free and fair elections in a timely manner. As we've seen in Burundi, when you have one person who decides to put themselves ahead of the Constitution and ahead of their people and the country, and to hold on to power at all costs and to use security forces to commit gross human rights violations, as we've seen, the results are catastrophic. So my hope is that we will not see the same thing in the Congo, that the government, that the security forces, and certainly President Kabila will make the right choices that they have indicated at times that they will make when it comes to respecting the Constitution and holding elections. But no one can guarantee what will happen and what kind of dire consequences will result if decisions are made to follow the precedent that Burundi has unfortunately set at this moment.
Some have raised issues about the West, the U.S., and the powerful nations of this world. They say they seem to be more concerned about maintaining a state of stability and therefore not pushing so hard on the area of justice, because it might include forcing people out of power, which could destabilize the area. How do you balance those two?
I mean, I think at this point there's a very clear principle that the President of the United States has laid out, especially at the African Union last summer, where he said what is most important is democratic succession and making sure that the voice of the people is heard. And that, for too long, in terms of our foreign policy in the past, we have sometimes looked at the trade-offs between stability and democracy. But really, the way we see it is that it's not a trade-off. They are part of the same package, that they are linked in the sense that the longer you have one person in power, where power is concentrated, the more that the stability of the country is dependent on that one person. And what happens, I would ask, when that person eventually departs? No one lives forever, and at that point, where does your democracy, where does your country go? When you have true democratic succession principles in place, and you have institutions that can guarantee that the transition will happen in a way that will maintain stability, that, I think, is the best way to bring both principles to bear, and that is the principles that we are supporting as a country.
Yes. In your assessment, has there been progress in the area of democracy in the last few years, or is the region, particularly that region, right there where it was a few years ago, or even going backwards?
I think it's hard to generalize. I think we've seen certain areas and countries that have made a lot of progress. So one place that I would point to, which we all are very, very pleased and are encouraging of, is Nigeria, where we had really great elections last year. You saw a change in power from the ruling party to the opposition, and we're seeing some important reforms and steps being taken by President Buhari. And we've seen other good elections happen, including in Cote d'Ivoire and so forth. But I think your point is a valid one, especially in the Great Lakes region. We're seeing, I think we're seeing some backsliding, frankly, whether it's across the river in the Republic of the Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, and some of the efforts there to change the Constitution by President Sassou Nguesso, whether we're looking at Burundi, whether we're looking at recent efforts by President Kagame in Rwanda to change the Constitution as well. These are all things that we are closely watching and that we have indicated concern in public statements and other efforts. And then, of course, Uganda as well, and the current efforts right now and the questions about the legitimacy of the elections. Those are all things that we are watching closely and engaging in terms of saying which way will democracy go in the region.
Well, Secretary Feldstein, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Vincent. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Well, Stephen Feldstein is the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Well, Jan Eliasson has a long and distinguished career as an international statesman. Among his many posts, he has served as Sweden's Minister for Foreign Affairs, UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and UN Special Envoy for Darfur. He is currently the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. VOA's Peter Clotty had an opportunity to speak with him about the success of the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa. That's including cooperation on climate change and international crime.
We're extremely happy that the member states really created a set of goals which could change the path we go on development in the next 15 years. They are already starting to implement them on the national level. This is the first year, this is the second month of the first year, and already we have 25 nations, close to 25 nations, wanting to tell us in the summer when we have a big meeting on implementation what they are doing. And this means that this has gone through as goals which are universal,
right,
adapted, should be accepted by all and lived up to all, rich and poor, that they are built on sustainability, and by that uniting the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals with the climate change agenda of Paris in December, that they are inclusive, that it has to reach everybody, and that we must have the ambition to fight inequalities and reach those who are furthest behind.
Despite the commitment they've shown so far, what are some of the challenges they're facing along the road in the implementation process?
These new goals, they affect all sectors of government and all sectors of society. We can't achieve these goals if we do not enter the area of how we organize our transportation systems, how we organize our energy systems, how we organize the agricultural structures, the industrial structures, how we deal with migration and urbanization. These sectors are traditionally, in many countries, seen as domestic.
Right.
But that's not correct anymore. In today's world, we are interdependent and these goals are interrelated. So we need to take away that false, artificial at least, line between national and international. In today's world, the good international solution, read migration, read climate change, is in the national interest of member states.
Well, that was Jan Eliasson, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, speaking to viewers Peter Clotty. Well, we want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa54. Check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vincent Makori. While still to come, we'll tell you why Africa is a beautiful continent. Stay with us.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better.
Celiac disease is an inheritable autoimmune disorder where the ingestion of gluten leads to damage in the small intestine. It affects 1 in 100 people worldwide. Gluten is a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, and people who are allergic to it must always avoid it. But knowing what foods contain gluten is not always clear. And that's why Shireen Yates of Sensor Labs developed this $200 portable food tester.
You can actually hear the crunching as we put it through.
As Yates puts the pocket-sized tester to work, up comes a result, a frowny face icon indicating that this snack food does in fact contain gluten.
1 out of 5 of the gluten-free dishes that we're testing out in restaurants are coming back positive for gluten.
Peanuts pose another serious allergy threat to some people, and Yates' company is working on a portable tester for them as well. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
Well, it's time for a business report. This week, Barclays announced 2015 earnings and restructuring plan for its future, which impact Africa. For more details, Africa 54 business correspondent Jim Malandrino joins us live from New York. Hi, Jill.
Hi, good morning, Vincent. CEO Jess Staley took charge on December 1st, and his mission was very clear that he wanted to shrink the workforce and right-size the business in an effort to restore profit growth and capital requirements. Part of that plan is to sell down its 62% stake in Barclays Africa over the next 2 to 3 years to a non-controlling stake of 50% or below, as well as certain operations in Asia, as the bank looks to focus on its U.S. and U.K. operations.
Now, Barclays just merged its business operations with South Africa's ABSA in 2013. Is it too soon for Staley to exit the businesses?
You know what? Many analysts are asking that question because Africa is a huge market with tremendous long-term prospects. But let's take a look at Barclays' year-end results for some context. We know about the restructuring, but the bank also cut its dividend for 2016. Barclays has had an issue of conduct and litigation issues, and CEO Staley's goal is to wind down non-core assets in an effort to simplify the business model. My concern is other investment exiting South Africa at this point.
Now, has Barclays actually learned any lessons at all from the 2008 global banking crisis? Because it seems some of these measures are rather extreme, right?
That's an excellent question, and in my mind, the global financial environment is a much bigger issue than crude oil prices, where we've had a lot of focus. Perhaps Barclays is being forward-looking. When the banks dragged the market down a few weeks ago, we spoke about the uncertainty of global central bank monetary policy. Staley said this is a very complicated environment in terms of monetary policy, and we are for sure in uncharted waters. So central banks around the world have done extraordinary things, and there's a deep desire to keep his bank back on track.
Well, Jill, thank you very much for your reporting.
Thank you.
Africa 54 business correspondent Jill Malandrino reporting live from New York. It's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54, and look at the beauty of Africa. We'll be right back.
If you've just joined us, I'm Mariama Diallo, and here is a quick recap of today's headlines. In South Africa, President Jacob Zuma survives a non-confidence vote in parliament after a heated attack on his reckless handling of the economy. In Ghana, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan joins his Ghanaian counterpart at the groundbreaking on the new terminal in Kotoka International Airport in the capital Accra as part of a two-day visit. In the Central African Republic, the Constitutional Court confirms that former mathematics professor Faustin Archange Touadéra has been elected president. In Nigeria, some major cities are facing fuel shortages, compounding energy crisis in the oil-rich country. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Action outside the debate hall.
Political season is about to change too.
VOA News, Las Vegas.
Welcome back. Now, when it comes to emerging economies, Africa is receiving a lot of positive coverage, especially in the Western media. Now, perhaps it's because the continent boasts of some of the fastest growing economies, best tourism spots, abundant natural resources, rich culture, great music, and a growing middle class. Africa 54's Paul Dio has more.
If you were to read any economic forecast on Africa written by the World Bank, IMF, the African Development Bank, and other multinational corporations in the last couple of years, you would notice that Africa's narrative is changing. Many economists say in 2016, sub-Saharan Africa's GDP is expected to grow at 4.5%, making it the fastest growing economic zone in the world. As a result, many international firms are setting up local and regional operations. Tourism on the continent is set to spur more economic growth and directly employ more than 7 million people by 2021, according to a World Bank report. Another study titled Millionaire Tourism in Africa says that around 43,000 multi-millionaires visited Africa. South Africa was the most visited destination for the super rich. Other destinations include Nairobi, Kenya, Masai Mara in Kenya, the Serengeti in Tanzania, gorilla safaris in Windy Forest, and Bujagari Falls in Uganda, Victoria Falls in both Zimbabwe and Zambia. The UK-based World Travel and Tourism Council says the influx of tourists means more money coming into the continent, accounting for nearly $50 billion in revenue in 2015. The continent prides itself of having the best land for exploring real beauty. For example, African mountains, savannas, and rivers are by far the natural assets found on the continent. The hospitality sector is experiencing unusual rapid growth. According to the report, Sub-Saharan Africa is benefiting most from the expansion of hotel chains and the corresponding increase in the number of available rooms. The vast continent is so rich and diverse in its culture. This is not from one country to another, but within individual countries, where many different cultures can be found. Africans are rocking the fashion runaways in New York, Paris, London, and primarily promoting Africa's fashion industry and lifestyle brands. Perhaps even more importantly, Nigeria's Nollywood film industry is rising in popularity. It's a $5 billion industry churning out nearly 3,000 movies each year. Since its inception over 20 years ago, the Nigerian movie industry has remained one of the largest employers in the country. And analysts said that the industry earns the third highest revenues in the world after Hollywood and Bollywood. We certainly cannot talk about Africa's beauty without talking about music, which is very much a part of the continent's culture. If you're passionate about African food, then you have something in common with a lot of Africans. They are passionate about making Africa's mouth-watering food locally and even continental dishes that has earned them the title of the best cooks in the world. Most African dishes are comprised of a rigged portion of sauce or fish, goat meat, beef stew, and this trend is evident everywhere you go in Africa. Paul Ndiho, VOA News.
Well, and that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. For more news, tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight, at 1800 UTC and in the mornings to Daybreak Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC, Monday through Friday. Thanks a lot for watching from all of us here in Washington. Have a good night.
Welcome to the Voice of America's Newswords.
Here is a story that has to do with defects or problems with cars.
Listen for the word that means to take back something. Recall.
They had meetings over this defect. They shared complaints over this defect. Yet there was no investigation by the government and no recall by General Motors until 10 years later.
Recall. It is a word that means to ask people officially to return something.
In our story, there were major problems with some General Motors cars. The man says the U.S. government and the car company took too long to issue a recall, so the cars could be fixed.
Now, when you hear the word recall, your American English will be good enough to know what this news word means.